Welcome back to the Learning Microsoft Azure course, in which I'm talking about web apps, Azure web apps, and this is video number 3, talking about configuring Azure web app settings. In this video, I would like to cover the following topics. First of all, how to configure Azure web apps general settings. Moving over to controlling web app authentication and authorization, making sure that if you're presenting your application, your web app, to the internet, that you can integrate it with a couple of different authentication solutions available today. In the next topic, I'm also talking about how to perform web app backups and obviously restores, and then ending this video talking a little bit about managing SSL certificates for securing your Azure web apps. So the first part, light introduction on configuring web apps general settings. Out of the Azure web apps general settings, it allows you to specify the specific web framework version, like the .NET framework you're using for your coding, PHP, Python, or the different versions supported. Next to that, we can do some configuration around autoswap, which I'll cover later on. If debugging is required or not. Connection strings if you're integrating with database solutions like SQL. And then one of the other interesting general settings that you might recognize from your on-prem web server infrastructure is defining the default documents. Which brings me to the next topic. It's about controlling web application authentication and authorization. This mainly defines if you want to provide your web application in an anonymous way or forcing authentication, which means that your end users or customers or anybody who wants to get access to your web application needs to provide authentication credentials, where at the time of creating this course, there are a couple of different authentication providers supported. Obviously, there's integrated support for Azure Active Directory. But besides those, there are also other ones out of social media. Azure Web App supports Facebook, Google accounts, Twitter accounts, and the Microsoft account, also known as Microsoft Live ID, allowing you to authenticate with an Outlook.com email address, for example. Now, once you're deploying, pushing out, publishing Azure Web Apps, know that you also have some options available to allow backup and restores. Now, quite important, backup and restore features are only available in standard and premium plans, not in the other ones. If you are opting in for standard and premium, the backup configuration is actually pretty easy to go through. You need to specify the storage account, defining the schedule, and if you're using a database out of your Azure Web App, then you also have to provide some database settings. The information that's getting backed up is the application configuration, the file content, and if you're using a database in the backend, then it will also take a backup of your Azure SQL database or a MySQL database. Other database formats are not supported out of the native web apps backup. And then the last topic I want to cover in this video is managing your SSL certificates. In about the same way as it's running on your on-premises infrastructure, web servers, Azure also supports integrating your Azure web apps websites with SSL certificates, giving you two different options. You can import application-specific certificates or uploading an external SSL certificate that you acquired from a public certificate authority. Once you have imported your SSL certificate, you also have to provide specific SSL bindings per hostname, as well as defining the SSL type you want to use, which can be server name indication based on host name or specifically IP based if you're like using multiple public IP addresses pointing to different web applications running on the same web server. So a lot of similarities from any typical on-prem web server like IIS or Apache on Linux, but this one is using Azure Platform Services. So with that, I'm going to show you in the portal where you can define those different settings, where in the meantime, my web app has been deployed. Let me quickly verify the one from Visual Studio should also be live. And showing you that it's actually working. going to copy this URL into my browser. And as you can see, my Visual Studio web application is also live. So with that, I'm jumping back to my Azure portal, selecting my web app, taking the one I deployed from Visual Studio, for example, and then walking you through some of the configuration settings. I talked about application settings. So here, since I deployed an ASP.NET application, I could, for example, specify here if it's the newest, latest .NET framework I'm using or an older one. If it would be PHP, then you could exactly do the exact same thing here. Some other settings is using swapping, using debugging, specific application settings, connection strings for pointing to a database, and specifying which of your default documents should be used. Another one that I talked about is authentication, where by default authentication is off, meaning I'm allowing anonymous access to my web app. Activating the authentication will expose you to different authentication providers. Let's say I'm using Azure Active Directory. Confirming the settings, saving the settings. Let's see if it's already activated. If I refresh my website, it should ask me for my Azure credentials. Apparently not here, although it provides me a login functionality here. Where I can provide my username and password. Or configuring with Facebook identity solution or using like a Microsoft account Live ID. So really interesting features. Think back about Azure Active Directory B2C scenarios, which is another useful one. This could be also interesting for your websites. I talked about Azure Backup, where I can configure my backup solution, providing a storage account where it needs to store my backup files, the schedule for my backups, and if I'm using a database in the backend to also keep backups of that database file. And then importing, configuring my SSL certificates, and linking my certificates to SSL bindings in basically the similar way as I'm doing in my on-prem web server infrastructure. So this was a quick walkthrough of some additional configuration settings on Azure Web Apps. In the next video, I will cover a little bit more about web app traffic and diagnostics.